Okay, this is Torchinsky Files. This is the Bally Astrocade episode. Hey pals, welcome again to the basement. Very excited to have you here today. Before we get started, I'm just going to clue you into a fun little bit of inside, behind-the-scenes tip here, and that it's almost 4 a.m. That's what I'm going to tell you right now, is that it's almost 4 a.m. And the reason it is such a ridiculous hour is because I can never seem to find time to film these during the day. I work all day writing, and then I try to do dad stuff after work, and for some reason I decided to finish painting my deck today, which is why I have blue paint on my hands. And then for this particular episode, I had to rig up this monitor on this side of the room so it would be near the machine I want to talk about and look for all these ridiculous adapters. Anyway, now it's 4 a.m. and I'm recording this now. But screw it. I'm up already. It's just too damn late, so I'm just going to power on through it. So, here we are, another edition of the Torchinsky Files, and this week I want to go back to my series where I cover some early home console driving games. And this time I'm going to be covering the Bally Professional Arcade. It's a fascinating, kind of weird machine that's not really well known, but it probably... I don't know if it should be better known, because it was kind of a failure, but it is a fascinating machine. So let's talk about this thing, all right? So, the Bally Professional Arcade, originally it was actually known as the Bally Home Library Computer, for some reason, is of course made by the company Bally, and Bally is part of Bally Midway. So for those of you that are maybe aware of old, or like golden age video game stuff, Bally Midway of course made all kinds of famous video games you know of. Pac-Man, for example. Even though it was a Japanese game made by Namco in America, all the machines were built by Midway, which was part of Bally. Bally had been making pinball machines since the 1920s, I think, so they have a long history in coin-op stuff. So, in the 70s, they realized home video game consoles were becoming a big thing. The Atari 2600 had just come out, so they wanted to enter the market as well. So what Bally did is they reached out to a company called Dave Nutting Associates, which is also famous because Dave Nutting Associates was the company that Nolan Bushnell worked with before he founded Atari to make the very first coin-operated arcade video game called Computer Space. So that's another strange tie-in. They went to the Nutting Associates and they asked them to develop them a video game system that would work both for arcades and a home console, like one basic platform. And that platform was developed by them, and it was a pretty damn good platform. It was used by Midway and Bally to make some pretty famous games like Gorf and Wizard of War, and also this machine you see here, the Bally Professional Arcade. Now, it was a Z80 based setup, which is one of the big processors of that time. There was like the 6502 and the Z80 were kind of the two big competitors. This machine was actually in many ways more powerful than the Atari 2600 or arguably even the Intellivision that came later. This was an interesting machine. So it had a decent CPU. It can actually generate 256 colors, which is amazing for the era, although the Atari could generate about 128, but you could only show about 4 on the screen at a time. Now, in the differences between the arcade motherboard that was made and the one for the home console, there were a few differences. So even though it was the same basic architecture, the arcade one could display more colors at a time, had a screen resolution of about twice what this could do. The arcade could do like 320 by 204, and this could only do 160 dots by 102. So it was definitely crippled from what the arcade version could do. But it was still a really good system. It had a good 3-voice sound chip. It had all kinds of really interesting things. So before we talk about the driving game specifically for it, let's take another look at it. If we look at the console itself, it's actually kind of bulky. It's got the wood grain that was possible back in the era. The top of it actually lifts off, and you have a place to store the cartridges that it would use. And the cartridges were specifically designed to be the same size and shape as a regular cassette tape, but they are actually just cartridges, and they just pop in right here in the console itself. And when you reset it, so you can see, there's what the cartridges look like. And what's cool is it actually had 4 built-in things. So you had this game called Gunfight, this thing called Checkmate, which was like kind of like the Tron light cycle thing, calculator, because that's a big draw. Look, you can use it as a calculator. Times 9 equals, look at that. Look at all that math that's happening there. That's some fun right there when you're at home and you want to gather the whole family around and really enjoy a calculator. Let's see, what else? They also had scribbling. Scribbling is kind of cool in that it was like a drawing game, but here's a little secret. If you're ever around one of these things and you hit 0 for the number of players, it goes into this little like kaleidoscope mode, which was, you know, kind of cool at the time. You having a party, you run that thing, yeah, you'd be a hit. So it's a fascinating machine in that it was cartridge-based, but it came with a bunch of built-in games, and the controllers were fascinating too. No other console really had controllers like this. They looked like this, these odd pistol grip kind of things, and on top you had a little knob. You had a knob that would work both as a joystick, you could move it around, and you could rotate it like a paddle. So for example, I can show you how this works. If we go to their little gunfighter game, and we let the little cowboys come out, you'll notice, so I can move my cowboy around with the joystick, just like you'd move a joystick, and then if I rotate the knob, you see the actual angle of the gun changes. And I could, of course, murder a man virtually. It's a fascinating controller. So you've got basically paddle, joystick, trigger, all in this one really fascinating little unit. It's actually a great controller, and I'm kind of surprised it hasn't caught on more, or it never caught on more in anything else. It's very, very clever. And the games themselves were actually potentially pretty good. Some of them were not great, but some of them were pretty impressive. Like their version of the game Wizard of War, for example, was actually really impressive. Listen to that. Oh, that vibrato is great. But you can see the actual game itself is quite good. It looks a lot like the original arcade version, and it plays great and has all the everything that they did. It was impressive. The machine itself was an impressive machine, but it just never really sold that well. They didn't sell it in retail outlets like they did with the Atari. It was sold in weird computer stores and no one knew about it, or you had to order it from a magazine. They had all these plans for this add-on computer called the Z-Grass that was done by these computer artists, calling themselves I wrote it down here. They call themselves the Circle Graphics Habitat. So it's got a lot of weird things associated with it. But at the same time, it's kind of a fascinating machine. Now, again, we're all about driving. We're an automotive blog. I'm here because I'm a car journalist. So what kind of driving games did this thing have? It didn't have many, but one of the ones it did is actually very historically significant, and I'll explain why. So one of the driving games it had was called 280 Zap. And then they had another game called Dodgem. These were both driving games. Now the interesting thing about 280 Zap is that it was the very first driving game to ever actually license a real car from a real car company. The Bally Midway licensed from Datsun the rights to use the name and image and likeness of the Datsun 280Z for this game. This game they had an arcade version that was programmed by one of the most famous trans programmers of the early arcade era, someone named Jamie Fenton. She was one of the big names of that era there, and it was a pretty popular game. It played a lot like a bunch of other games of the time, a front view driving game like Night Driver or something like that. But again, significant because it was officially licensed from Datsun to use the 280 name and likeness. And Datsun actually offered a version of the 280Z called the Zap Edition that was yellow and black and kind of matched the look of the car in the game. So let's check out what it's actually like to play this driving game. So we're going to do 280 Zap, and a race time, we'll say 5, I don't know what the units are. All right, so there's the hood of the car. These are the like markers. It's like the old game Night Driver. Here's our speedometer, and then how do I go? Oh, it's on this pedal. I grabbed also, okay, when you crash, it says amazing things. Like that one said Zork, because that's what a crash sounds like, Zork. All right, here we go. So you actually use a little knob to steer. The trigger button is the accelerator, and it's just a very straightforward driving game. That hood doesn't even really necessarily look much like a 280Z, but it technically is. And it's you know, there were a whole bunch of driving games like this. Atari's Night Driver. These were all copied from a game called Autobahn that was made in Germany. A Night Driver was copied from that. These things were copied from there. So none of these are that original, but it is kind of fun. This is not a fantastic driving controller, but at the same time, it's better than just a stick using the little knob. So look, it's not a great game, but it's kind of a fun game. And I love that it says Zork when you crash sometimes. But let's check out the other game. So the other version on here is Dodgem, and I think Dodgem is pretty terrible. Let's look. Oh, yes. Yes, it is. Again, this one, okay, you're using the knob to move back and forth. This is just one of those top-down car driving games. You can see where they reused from, because it's on the same cartridge, they reused the speedometer and the bang, boom, pow text. But why did they pick these colors? Your car's yellow, which is fine. The other cars are red, is fine. But why this like Pepto-Bismol pink for everything else? I don't get it. They literally could have picked anything. This thing had 256 colors to pick from, and they thought driving, a road, pinkish. Makes no sense at all. All right. Oh, there we go. Zork. Oh, I'm glad we got another Zork. Yeah, it's a fascinating machine, the Bally Astrocade. I recommend looking it up. They're very hard to find. They tend not to last very long because they overheat a lot, but it's really fascinating. Another interesting thing I want to point out is they actually had a special basic programming cartridge for it that had a jack on it for you to program in a cassette recorder. So people actually started writing their own games for this crazy thing, which is even more insane. And you would program everything via this tiny little keypad, and you had to have like a little overlay, and I just had to make one by hand because I couldn't find actually one. But I think they're on, you can buy them online. But fascinating thing, they actually used to all come with this basic cartridge, and the fact that it had a little jack on there to load in things is amazing. Nowadays, you can actually plug your phone in there and load in different software and actually play homebrew games from, you know, the 70s and 80s, and when people actually had these things. Anyway, Bally Astrocade, fascinating system, not amazing driving games, but one very significant historical driving game. And look, I'm just glad you know about it now. If you ever see one, pick it up because they're very uncommon and they're actually a hell of a lot of fun. So yeah, there we go. Thanks for coming out to my basement. I'm gonna get my ass to bed.